This is a book which has been a very long time in gestation, and it's still having trouble being born. I think we're looking at a Caesarean operation here, but it is very, very near to appearing. It's taken me the best part of, it's been my principal research project for about 15 years. It's taken me far too long, and had I known what it was going to be, the effort involved, I wouldn't have probably embarked on it in this way, though it started off as something rather different. It was also, I got a lot of criticism while in post because it wasn't REF friendly, and people, you know, the emphasis on production. The other thing I want to say about it is that the book couldn't have been written without the work that so many other scholars have done on the university and the wider scene. You'll notice just a word on the title, Enlightened Oxford. I did try and suggest to the publisher that a question mark after that might be in order, but they thought, no, just go for it and see what you can, see what the response is. So I think I just need to say what I'm about there. I don't think the 18th century Enlightenment is something that one can ignore in writing a book about the intellectual life of the period. It is okay. Enlightenment is a kind of catch-all. It isn't Enlightenment Oxford. I think that's quite significant. And if we all think of what the university motto is, that perhaps provides me with some sort of excuse for squeezing this in. It's also a catchy title, and I need all the sales pitches I can get. And of course, it's got the Enlightenment. One thing we do know about the Enlightenment is that there are multiple contexts to it. I don't believe with my old friend Jonathan Clark that one can disinvent the Enlightenment and try and sort of write it out of existence. It's rather like nuclear weapons. Once we've got it, we're sort of stuck with it. And there's too much of a scholarly industry investment in the Enlightenment, for heaven's sake. We can't get rid of it. We can't disinvent it. What sort of view of Enlightenment do I take? Well, a very sort of broad one. I have fought shy of definitional over aptitude, because one thing is clear, is that the Enlightenment isn't a homogeneous cultural space wherever one finds it articulated. Do I take a fairly sort of straight line approach to Enlightenment, define the definition of Enlightenment in the kind of Jonathan Israel or John Robertson manner? No, I don't, for reasons that I've gone into, that I go into in the book. My approach is sort of the John Pocock approach of let multiple enlightenments flourish. Now, I think one can say a word, one can argue that case on either side of the proposition, but that's what I've chosen to do. This is not another history of the university. We've got plenty of those. We've got plenty of some very good recent college histories which have come out over the last generation. It's a study of a major corporate institution and its relationship and its place in the outside world. Oxford, after all, is a constitution. The university is a component of the Constitution, recognised by Blackstone, among other commentators, with a parliamentary presence. So this is something which has a public importance and of interest to others other than its membership. Nor, my book argues, is the university condemned to marginality in 18th century national and international life because of its apparent reluctance to modernise the curriculum or endorse progressive politics. There are all kinds of ways in which the curriculum is sort of short-circuited, avoided and adapted. And the book goes into some of that. The university, I argue, has a capacity for adaptation and a scope for intellectual and political pluralism, which, if one finds it hard enough, we will encounter. Its political preferences fascinated contemporaries. but also permitted the construction of a monolithic Tory, Jacobite, even Jacobite character, which is far from the whole story, but it has an enduring power and an enduring currency. And it was in the interests of a lot of people who weren't friendly to the university to persist with it and argue it strongly. Believe me, there are plenty of Whigs in this book. That's whatever spelling you want to give it. Too many dead white men, my family say, but no, we'll avoid that. So this is an unavoidably politically component of the British state with a degree of political pluralism, if one looks for it, which one can find. Okay, so I'm going to, after rattling that off, let me go into the structure of the book. Here it is, 12 chapters. So there's an introduction and a conclusion. There are 3 sections: intellectual presences, institutional presence and interactions, cultural constructions, connections, and tensions. If I have the chance to use alliteration, I will always do so. So I begin by, rest of my case, fame, form and function, the university's place and purpose in the long 18th century. You can see the 3 different sections. I look at the university's vitality or the lack of it. That necessarily involves a look at the historiography and much of the myth-making and presentation of Oxford in the 18th century by those who were quite happy to jump on the rubbishing bandwagon. University under form, I look at the student body, a little bit at the curriculum, something on the social life and connection with elites outside lay and clerical, and the national significance of its transformational building program, particularly in the beginning of the century and later on, and then to consider what its function was. So that's by, you have to get those things out of the way early on, otherwise the contexts are going to be not sufficiently put well in place. And then here's another kind of introductory section in which I look at the challenges, political and intellectual, posed by the revolutions or centres of learning in Britain and Ireland. And I look at Oxford's responses to, if you like, the changeover of 1688 and everything that follows from that, and compare it with those of other universities across the British Isles. And then towards the end of that chapter, I take a quick, well, not a quick peep, actually, an extended look at its relationship to the Enlightenment. But I try there not to get bogged down too much in it. In the end, I'm an archival historian, and too much intellectualizing tends to not be good for me. So, okay. So one of the most important things is, so we've now entered part 1. The Oxford's existence, of course, is bound up with the defence and perpetuation of the established church. And it's appropriate, I think, in those circumstances to have a chapter which is foundational to the whole structure, because the defence of the Church of England in the 18th century is also one, by definition, of defence of the university. You can't have one without the other very easily. And I make an argument for saying, actually, the corporate importance of the university within the life of the church increases after the suppression of convocation in 1717. And I also argue, as strongly as I can, but I hope not to go taking it too far, for the importance of the university and its products in keeping the nation outwardly Christian, at least, and maintaining the public culture of the faith. You can see the different sections of the chapter here: scripture, sermons and public theology, the variety of Oxford voices on religion, and the restatement of orthodoxy in the different forms that could take, a kind of creative and a varied response to presenting the faith, How far is church and state aligned? Well, we know the traditional story, I'm sure, about the difficulties of the first part of this era, but there is a gradual movement towards convergence. I'm sorry that Methodists are last in this case, but they are there. Yes, the arts and humanities. So what I'm doing in this chapter, as with all of them, is trying to look at the kind of outward impact and mechanisms of Oxford life and the way in which it sort of draws in and it extends outwards to the world beyond the university. So I'm here to talk about the importance of the commercial print world, moving towards recognizing an outside audience and markets. Certainly towards the end of in the second half of the century, people like Dodsley are intimately connected with a lot of Oxford figures. And so that connection to the book trade of the capital is very important. I also try here, among many other themes, to talk about the way in which the growth of empire in the 18th century is assisted by the consolidation of Oriental language studies in the university. The chair in Arabic had been established since before the Civil War, and of course one finds the trailblazing work of people like Sir William Jones in Persian and Sanskrit later on. Yes, you might say to me, well, look at the Phalaris controversy earlier in the century, which involved Boyle, Bentley, classic Oxford, Cambridge, ancient and modern's match. But even that, I think I would argue, is one which engages the interests of the outside world, not least because it's a kind of rather enjoyable slanging match between some very difficult individuals. History writings there, and music is last but not least. I made quite a lot of the Holywell Music Room and the concert scene in 18th century Oxford and tried to locate that within that growth of provincial music culture as well. Science. Yes, this was a difficult chapter to write. I have taught the history of science in this period. But I think if it doesn't go beyond this room, I had quite a couple of run-ins with Lawrence Brockles about Oxford science in this period, and we couldn't agree. I think my starting point for looking at science is that nowhere in Europe was the curricular importance of the natural sciences really recognised very much before about 1850. So if Oxford isn't doing that, we shouldn't really be surprised. Also, yes, I talk about the Newtonian challenge, but I also make clear just what a vital Newtonian centre Oxford was in the first 2 or 3 decades of the 18th century. And also other sort of star billing, if you like, would be the reputation the university had for astronomy, people like Halley, Bradley and Hornsby all working here. And getting a lot of public notice and drawing in outsiders to their lectures, catering for women who wanted to attend those lectures, as many did. So there's the story, I argue, is essentially fairly upbeat and Whiggish, if you like, gradually improving facilities and experimentation, and a sort of lecturing scene that attracted wide audiences, both early in the century and in the middle decades. I also make some play of the importance of the opening of the Radcliffe Hospital, and what it shows about Oxford's participation in the medical Enlightenment, the fact that many of the Radcliffe trustees who sponsor that are high Tories in point of fact, and also something about the later advances in chemistry and the episode of the 1790s in which Thomas Beddoes was had to leave the university because of his political views. So that, I think, says a little bit about, I hope that gives you a flavour of what I'm trying to do there. That's one of the shortest chapters in the book, probably because I wanted to get out of it quickly. Here's something that always interests me as a historian who found writing for the ODMB one of the most enjoyable things that they did in their career. Just talking about the link between personnel and the polity, and in a way which I don't think has ever been systematically done, and I've tried to do that here. I've really enjoyed writing about the chancellors. I've already written quite extensively about the Earl of Arran, Chancellor, Oxford's longest living chancellor from 1715 to 1758. And those who succeeded him were no less significant. And all the importance of having people like Lord North and later the Duke of Portland as the university's senior representatives. I do talk about heads of houses, but it's not an extensive list. I'm not trying to cover everything. That's been done in separate histories. That isn't my purpose here. Trying to connect those men of significance to the wider political world. So there's a lot here about Henry Aldrich, Cyril Jackson, to name but two. Others crop up as well. We could have a really good day conference on Cyril Jackson, I suspect, but I might be struggling to get attendees. Perhaps not after they've read this book. And then a little bit about tutors, again selective, but illustrating themes about the link to patrons and parents, very often the same thing. The role of college visitors, many of them Episcopal, it's not really being covered very extensively. I try to do that here. And also the way in which the trouble or the challenge that the successive bishops of Oxford, Cuddesdon had in getting on with the university, particularly when their politics didn't match. So I think that's one of the chapters I enjoyed writing most. Moving on again into this sort of political dimension. Oxford and the Crown, the classic two periods, if you like. There are a lot of subheadings within this long chapter. You'll find this book has got chapters which are, to my way of thinking now, a bit overlong, but anyway, I'm stuck with it. So you can, I'll move on very quickly from here because I don't want to labour the point. You'll be able to see it when the book appears very shortly. Oxford and the world of Westminster, how do they actually manage to work with the regime? Whig versus Tory coexistence. It's very important to keep at bay direct ministerial involvement, let alone a royal visitation. It's really important to present the best face of the university in Parliament, particularly during the Walpolean years, to lobby successfully for it. I go into some detail about administrative and academic nexuses and the way in which patronage helps. There's a lot to defenders in Parliament about MPs for the university, and thank goodness Roger Newdigate left a large archive because many of the other MPs unfortunately didn't. So, yeah, you can see what that's all about. Distinctive themes, again outward looking, trying to see what kept the show on the road and the relationship with the government. Chapter 9, self-explanatory, really, I think. How does the university and its members engage with the wider world? So I talk about town and gown relationships, pretty good actually for most of the 18th century by comparison with previous eras. And I also look carefully at the relationship between not just the county of Oxfordshire, but the South Midlands as a whole, because the links are there. Yeah, section B covers property ownerships. Again, Oxford college stewards often travelling to remote areas to see how tenants were doing, and that relationship extended all over the country. Relationship between schools, not just Westminster and Eton, with the university. And I also try there to say something about the growing credibility of schoolmastering as an emerging profession, and one which was, I think, absolutely vital and underestimated in inculcating what one might call today core values in pupils there. So I do think that's one of the more original sections of the book. And then, as you can see, links to Wales, Scotland and Ireland, all systematically considered, with some consideration of cultural constructions of Britishness. So moving into the last part of the book, the university seen from outside. Again, a really enjoyable chapters to put together to look at how others saw Oxford. I examine the question of guidebooks, and I enjoy quoting from favourable visitors and those who were very impressed with the university and said so. Dissenters and Methodists, have dissenters all got it in for the university? Well, you have to read and find out, won't you? Methodism, John Wesley, of course, had this love-hate relationship with the university. He owed so much to it. Again, something I've written about very recently. But on the other hand, he produced that rip-roaring sermon of 1744 in front of the Vice-Chancellor and the whole university, and told them what a godless lot they were, and he was going. And that was the end of that. But of course, continued to draw his Lincoln College emoluments until 1751, which I think, had he not had that fellowship, Methodism may really have struggled, actually. Sort of graduates from elsewhere, those who come on from people like Adam Smith, who's really very anti-Oxford. But not just him, other Scots too. What did they think of it? What did Cambridge people think of Oxford? And then I look at insiders as outsiders. Wesley crops up there again. So does Gibbons, Vicessimus Knox, the people who wanted to keep alma mater at a distance. There's a lot on. I wanted to say more about women, but in the end, I had to sort of largely corral them into this separate subsection. Apologies for that. But that's the nature of looking at an 18th century elite world. But multiple female presences at every social level, and I really enjoyed trying to write about that and do justice to that theme. Formal occasions, great opportunities for the inside world of the university and the outside world to come together and really have a rip-roaring time, acts and seniors and other social occasions. So yeah, that was fun too. The wider world, penultimate chapter, Oxonians in Europe and beyond, European scholars coming to Oxford, the Bodleians, a really important research centre throughout the century. That link, consider, if you like, a more metaphysical link between Oxford and the Republic of Letters, which I think is still a viable concept for much of the 18th century. And then finally, in that section, Oxford and the British Atlantic and emerging imperial involvements. And the last chapter is what I call insider trading, which helps to explain the university's enduring centrality and leverage in national life. Patronage and power brokerage, obviously, this is a book about the 18th century, but I really also emphasize the importance of family, friendship, and other foci for loyalties rather than just money and jobbery. Clerical culture beyond Oxford, considered in connection and individual items. I there take up Roy Porter's theme about the importance of the parsonage as a scholarly centre across the 18th century intellectual world, and the way in which a lot of those men had connections with Oxford. A lot of them were invited to come back sometimes to deliver the Bampton lectures after 1780. Others didn't want to come back and just thought they could get more work done by not being in a university. That sounds familiar. And then lastly, bequests and legacies. Where would the university be without its gift culture? Asking us to stump up money. Well, certainly going on in a big way in the 18th century. And obviously the importance of founders When benefactors were commemorated, as they were regularly in multiple occasions, clearly the subtext was, and you too must cough up in your time and endow something. I think that probably covers a lot. Yeah, it does. I was going to, I could read you the last page of the last chapter, which sort of sums things up. Oxford was a university rooted in the past, and yet in many regards it looked to the future and showed itself careful of adaptation in incremental ways. It may never have had that charisma associated with celebrity professors, scholarly journals, and massive libraries that made Hanoverian Göttingen the epicenter of the academic German Enlightenment. Yet Robert Louth and Thomas Wharton, John Cale and Thomas Hornsby, Benjamin Kennicott and Benjamin Blaney, William Blackstone and William Jones merited international notice and the bodily and attracted scholars from across Europe. Likewise, the print culture of Oxford, though offering a smaller stage for culture and engagement than London's, offers as a vantage point on Enlightenment to be set alongside that of Edinburgh or Dublin. 18th century Oxford was never an archetypal Enlightenment centre. It was too clerical, too conservative, and too centrifugal for that. But its forgotten diversity was itself a token of Enlightenment. It was itself a token of Enlightenment, its contrapuntal liminal contribution to that international phenomenon. The motives and intentions of its members who participated locally, nationally, and internationally in a vast complex of debates varied as much as the ideas they put forward. But in the end, it was the institution itself that represented an authoritative interpretation of truth, which is why if the University of Oxford resists final intellectual classification in this era, its powerful influence in, across, and beyond the polity is indubitable.